All right, so I'm gonna talk for a little bit about starting a coil built piece. Um, so hopefully you've read the project sheet. We're gonna go over where our project for coil building is gonna be based on what's called trompe-l'oeil, and basically it's the act of using clay or using something to make it look as realistic as possible or to mimic something. So there's some artists on the handout that you'll need to research and just see what they've made, maybe to help jumpstart some ideas. And again, some of those that you find influential need to go into the sketchbook as with also sketches for what you want to create. So you have to think about a single object that you can create that is going to be 18 inches tall. So we want to think about proportions with that. So if we're thinking about something that's wider than it is tall, might not be a great idea, especially if it's twice as wide as it is tall, because then it would be something 36 inches wide by 18 inches, and that might not really be feasible for the time we have allotted for this project. So it might be better to think about something vertical oriented that you can recreate as close to as possible, or with as close accuracy as possible to proportions, symmetry, surface decoration, things like that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how to start things like that. So grab some clay. So I know most people's things are going to be, we're going to have kind of a variation of what people make that are not all going to be the same. So I'm just going to start with just a really simple coil built form that'll hopefully translate into what you want to make, and we can talk about this in class. Some ideas you might have, what you think will work, won't work, and if you're not sure how to start, I'd be more than happy to discuss that with you as well. So I'm just going to take one of these little logs of clay, and first thing I'm going to do is I'm obviously going to build from the ground up, similar to our pinch pots but with coils. But first I'm going to start with a slab for a flat bottom. Again, kind of depending on what you want to make, you might have a flat bottom, you might have a round bottom, you might have legs, or like kind of a tripod like we talked about with some of the cups. And again, with those we can kind of talk about how to deal with that. But for right now, I'm going to kind of go over a real general way of doing this that'll probably fit most things. So I'm going to take this and just kind of start rocking it in a circular motion. Start flattening it out. Again, it's going to crack a little bit here on the outside, but that's okay. This clay's a little bit stiff. Yours will be a little bit softer. And I can just kind of smush that down. Again, most things cracking at this stage aren't a huge deal. Clay is soft enough where I can just mush things back together. But obviously this is too thick. And so I want to, what we call throwing out a slab to thin this out a little bit. We want to be somewhere between about like 1/4 of an inch to maybe 3/8 of an inch. Again, we're going a little bit bigger than we did with those pinch cups. Pinch cups we could get away with being really thin, but now we have to start thinking about gravity, the weight of clay on top of clay, so we don't want to go too thick. We don't want to go too thin to impede our building or to make the piece want to collapse or crack. And we also don't want to go too thick, because too thick is going to restrict how slow it's going to dry compared to thinner areas, and it's also going to most likely induce cracking. So we want to be careful of all of those things. So about 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch is pretty good. 3/8 of an inch is pretty thick. Again, if you're going out, you might need to be a little bit thicker than if you're going straight up and down. Straight up and down, or even conical, the clay doesn't need as much support, but if you're kind of going out or in a rounded fashion, sometimes that clay needs more support and needs to be a little thicker on the bottom. Doesn't need to be crazy. Sometimes just letting it stiffen up through drying is enough. So then I have this kind of made into this big kind of thick pancake-like shape. I'm gonna start throwing it out. And essentially what I'm gonna do, rather than trying to slam this down as hard as I can, I'm gonna actually throw it down at an angle. To help get the clay to actually hit the table, catch it, and then everything above what touches the table is going to sort of shift over and stretch. And so I'm doing this right on my work table. And so my work table is built a little bit more to work directly on. So these bottoms are a little bit more, we have the concrete wedging tables in both rooms. So they're a little bit more effective for throwing slabs out. You can do this on the wooden tables. Just make sure that you're picking up the clay a lot because it will want to stick to the table. So you have to be really aware of that. Whereas the concrete tables, the clay is not going to want to stick to as much. So I'm just going to take my clay and start sort of flinging it at an angle. You can see it's starting to thin out. Again, it's not perfectly even, and that's okay. Now that I've got this started, I'm going to go ahead and use a rolling pin to help level it out. And so I'm just using this rolling pin just to level it out. If you can see, my edges are about the thickness that I want, maybe a little bit thinner in some spots, but my inside's a little bit thick still. So I just want to go ahead and softly press in this to even it out. And notice as I do this, I'm going to move the clay a lot so it doesn't want to stick. You know, I'm not adding moisture to the clay because, again, that's going to make it want to stick. I'm going to pinch that together really quick. Same with over here. This is wider than I need it to be, which is good. The edges are always going to tear and crack like that. So that's why it's important to try and make a slab larger than you need, because the edges are either going to be cracked or too thin. And so what this is doing, again, it's evening the clay out, not using a lot of pressure. And it's also, again, helping to align those particles, helping to compact them and compress them. So speaking of compress, you can see there's all sorts of little cracks on the surface. This is when I'm going to come back in with a rib. I'm going to use a plastic one, but you can use a metal one or a wooden one. We just want to smooth out all of those cracks that started from the stretching or any of the clay overlapping. And again, not only is it better to start with smooth clay, but this compression of it is really going to make it stronger. You know, as we make things larger, especially flat in the bottom like this, they're more than willing to want to crack or break on you. And so by compressing them like this, it makes them much stronger. And as I'm compressing, you notice I go in a lot of different directions. You know, we don't want to line up the particles all in one direction. It's all about, you know, thinking about creating like a cross-hatching sort of interwoven memory for all of our particles. Okay, so now I got my slab, and this is what I'm going to start with. So rather than building directly on the table, I'm going to build on a wear board. I'm going to build this on top of a wear board, and these are over in one corner of the ceramic studio. And so I built it on here, basically so, you know, I'm going to be working on this off and on. And as I do that, you know, you're going to be putting stuff on your shelf, off your shelf, taking it around the room and things like that. And so it's much safer to carry this board than carry your piece, because at certain points your piece is going to be really soft. You know, think about how easy it was to squish something small. These big pieces, as they're wet, they're still going to smush just as easy. So we want to move things by the board and move them around gently. So rather than, also just don't want to work directly on this board. I want to work on top of a piece of newspaper because the clay will want to stick to the board. And again, that could cause issues with cracking or breakage. And so having the newspaper is going to make that act as a barrier. And so I just use one sheet of newspaper. That's all you need. If you do multiple layers, it's going to cause problems for your clay, causing it to warp and things like that. So just use one nice smooth sheet. And then we also have these boards that have Lazy Susans on the bottom, and basically they're meant to spin around much easier, because again, while this big piece is wet, if we try and spin it around in our hands, it's going to cause a lot of problems. But if I can set it on here, and all of a sudden it spins by itself, and I don't have to worry about hurting the clay. So at this point, we got our slab. This is where you would want to cut this to the diameter that you need for your piece to fit the right proportions. I'm basically just going to cut a big circle. Like so. So this is going to be the bottom of my piece. Work that in. This will be my bottom where I start building coils. So before I start making coils, I've got to prep this a little bit. And so right now you can see here that I have this kind of hard edge here, this big flat edge with a flat edge on the side. That's going to be really difficult to transition a coil on. Our first coil connected to this slab is in many ways the most important one, because if this one breaks, our whole piece is going to fall apart. And so we want to make sure this one's done really well. So rather than leaving this hard edge, I'm going to just press this in on the edge so that I get more of sort of a slope to it, or an angle. And this is going to make for a much better, stronger connection. Like so. And then I'm going to take some water. I'm going to take my fork or needle tool or serrated rib, what have you, and score this edge where I'm going to put my first coil. And as I do that, I'm going to dip a little bit of water in here, just because it's going to help make sure that that adhesion is really strong. Just going to score this really well. Maybe give it a couple passes with a little bit more water. So see how really aggressive this surface is? If you just put a few lines in there, it's gonna fall apart. Sometimes I'll just see people take a needle tool and just do that sort of thing. Like, that's not gonna hold anything to anything. So it's really important that it's really aggressively scored. So I'm gonna set this to the side real quick. I'm gonna take some of my excess clay from making that slab. And this is kind of like when I talked about making those handles. This clay is a little bit stiff, so I'm just gonna work a little bit of water into it to rehydrate it. Make sure I can roll a nice smooth coil, or smooth enough at least. Okay. So before I start rolling the coil on the table, I'm basically going to squeeze it into this long, coil-like shape. This way, like, most of the work is done for me. I just got to make it a little bit thinner. Right now, this is pretty thick. I want this to be more the size of like a magic marker or a Sharpie, like really no thinner than a Sharpie. If you're going down to like pencil or anything much smaller than that, you're gonna have a lot of problems. So a Sharpie or thicker. A little thicker than a Sharpie is even a little bit better. So I'm gonna roll this out. Again, my table's dry. I don't want my table to be wet because the clay is gonna stick to wet surfaces. And my goal for rolling this out is to get however long it gets. It doesn't really matter the length of it. I just wanted the scale of that to be as even as possible. There's going to be some cracks in it. There's going to be some dents in it. All of that's okay. It's kind of like when we were working on the pinch pots. Certain things can only get so smooth when they're wet, in the wet stage of clay. So all of those imperfections will be cleaned up in the leather hard stage. So if there are little imperfections in your coil, it's not the end of the world. And so to do this, I'm going to keep my hands together, because I want to use both hands to kind of maximize my rolling ability. But I also am worried about if I start moving my hands apart from each other, I'm going to be trying to basically roll out different parts of the coil at once, and that's going to cause imperfections. And they might also not roll at the same speed. Whereas if I tie them together like this, they're going to have a uniform speed and contact. And so I'm not really pressing a lot, because again, pressing a lot might make it want to stick. And I'm just kind of going back and forth, left to the right, making sure it's as even as I can as I go around. Like so. So there's my coil. You know, it's about that thick. So yeah, actually quite much more thicker than a Sharpie, but that's okay. This is more the thickness we want. It's like 2 Sharpies almost, but that's okay. So I've got my coil now to get started. I'm gonna bring my base back, my slab back. And so to put this on, I'm basically gonna start on one side, and I'm gonna pinch and squeeze down to make sure that this clay really works itself over the edge there. Make sure that the clay really works, the coil works into the slab. Because again, this is in many ways going to be the weakest part of the clay piece. So by trying to add strength now, that is better. So I didn't get all the way around. I'm just going to grab a little smidge of clay and make a little coil in my hand, and then just work that in, like so. I've got my first coil on, and as we go, you know, similar to with the pinch pots and what I was talking about with the bottom of this, the compression of the coils together is going to add so much strength and hopefully not have your piece fall apart. So again, adding this first coil to the slab is really important in its compression. So I'm going to use my fork, or again, whatever I have to score my coil down into the slab to make sure that I really get these blended together. And I'm going to use my fingers or a rib or what have you to compress these two together really well. And then sometimes I'll put a little dot of water on here. Again, I'm not trying to soak anything because that's going to make the clay weaker, but sometimes a little bit of water helps with the friction. Anytime you have a coil meeting a coil or a coil meeting a slab and you leave the seam visible, 99% of the time that turns into a crack or a broken piece. So it's really important that you compress them together really well. And I'm going to do the same thing on the outside. Sometimes this newspaper can get in the way. As long as we have newspaper under the piece, we're okay. We don't need it sticking out. There we go. Now I'm going to rib this outside. So again, we're getting little fissures and things like that in the edge here, the top of our coil there. It's not a big deal because we're going to add more coils to it. It really doesn't matter what the edge looks like until we're to the top. And then that's going to be dictated by your form. So I'm going to move this to the side and add some more coils on here. So again, I'm going to add a little bit of moisture on here. Make sure the clay is nice and soft. The softer it is, it's going to want to adhere to itself better. And that's a good thing. So I know there was a lot of kind of extra compression, or not extra compression, but compression in steps and adding that first coil on. So again, these all need to be compressed together for strength, but I'm not going to do that with each coil. I'm going to put 3 rows of coils on before I compress more. And so as I put this next coil on, if you can see, my fingers on the outside aren't really doing much except supporting the clay. And then my thumb here on the inside is sort of pinching and pushing the clay down to help smear it together. Because we want to get these adhered together as much as possible. So I didn't quite make it around again. Last time I just made a little piece, but this time I'm just going to go ahead and make another big coil. Because like I said, I want to be able to go around 3 times before I start compressing. I can make coils as long as I want, as short as I want. You know, the shorter they are, the more you have to make. The longer they are, maybe the less you have to make. But sometimes longer ones can be a little harder to manage. So as I add these coils, I want to make sure that I always suspend the clay. I don't want to put any clay on where it isn't being connected. Like trying to do this isn't going to be very efficient. So I want to keep it suspended, and you notice here I just kind of carried where that hole was. And now I'm just going to spin around. Like so. And I need about another half layer more. And this one's longer than I need, but that's okay. So I'll just tear off the excess and use it here in a little bit. Okay. So I've got my 3 new layers, so I need to compress these. So I'm going to go ahead and score the outside again. A lot of times you may have been told by other people that you need to slip and score or put water or slip in between all of these layers of coils. I highly recommend not doing that. Mostly because if you do that, it's going to take like 4 times as long to make your piece. Because every time you're adding slip or water, again, you're weakening the clay. Whereas this method of scoring these on the outside and really compressing them together as you put them on and then afterwards is going to make your clay pieces plenty strong enough and make you build a lot faster. So now I'm just going to compress again. As I compress these, I always try and compress things down, down or at least downward, so that the seams get tighter. If you start compressing upward, you're going to start separating those coils, and that can start giving you some separation or cracks in the future. So at this point, this clay is not looking very, it's not smooth, it's not pristine, it's not quite to the point of, for a round shape, fully round or symmetrical. And that's because if I fuss too much over the outside, it's not going to matter here in a few moments because I got to compress this inside, and that's going to have an effect on what's happening on the outside. So again, I want to get these coils compressed together as much as I can, so there's no cracks. But the general surface of it is going to be much easier to clean as it gets leather hard, or even we get the full form going to really get a good look of what's happening. I'm going to score the inside really well. And then come back with my rib. As I'm ribbing, especially here on the inside, it's really easy to push out and make this wider than I want it to be. So it's really important that my left hand is supporting the clay on the outside so that it doesn't stretch out any more than I want it to. So our goal here is for the walls all to be the same thickness from top to bottom so that it dries out evenly and doesn't want to crack. A little bit off here and there is not a big deal, but we don't want really thick areas. I do like to we can kind of have this big thick end, or I can use the rib to help taper this edge. I like this tapered edge a little bit more for adding the next coil on. Having it just a little bit thinner there makes a much stronger adhesion, and it also helps me not get thick spots. So, right now this is just kind of a vertical shape. Again, what you're trying to make, it might need to be different. You could push this out to make it wider if you need to be wider, or start pushing it out if you needed to create something that starts to go out. I can just use this rib and start pushing out a little bit more, while the clay is nice and soft. As I push out more, this clay is going to get a little bit weaker. I can patch some of these bigger areas right here. And so I might find that as I start spreading it open, this bottom here is going to get really wobbly and weak. And if that starts to happen, you might have to just give it a few minutes to dry. You could use, we have some hair dryers in the ceramic studio, and that can help speed up drying the clay out as well. So let's get some more coils on here. If as you're rolling your clay out, you start to feel flat spots starting to happen, which is can happen a lot, especially for beginners. You're just, what's happening is that either one, your clay is too dry and just needs some moisture worked into it, or two, you're pressing too hard. I don't want to, getting this clay to stretch out, it's soft, so we don't have to use a whole lot of force, but we don't want, so we don't need to like kind of push down onto it too much. It's more just kind of a gliding pressure. Okay, and so I'm just going to add this one the same way. squeezing from the outside to keep the clay stable, and then smearing down with my thumb.
If you got a spot being thick, that's okay. You just try and roll over that area a little bit more. You don't want to try and focus on one spot because it might stand out too much. And again, overstress the clay, but you want to make it look cracked.
And then so right now, I could take this one a little bit further, but I don't want to get too close to this seam underneath. So I'm going to pull that back so that I can overlap over that seam a little bit easier. So rolling coils is going to be one of those things that I'm making look really easy. So if your coils, you're not happy with them, feel free to just ball them back up and start over. It's like anything that we're going to do in this class. It's a new skill. The first one you make is probably not going to be great. It's just going to take practice. So I've got my 3 coils. So I'm going to score the outside.
Yeah, make sure none of those seams are showing. Do the same to the inside. We're going to taper this edge on the top.
And again, if I need this to widen out, I can use more of the rib pressure on the inside to make that round out if I need to. Or I can keep going up straight vertical or conical, again, kind of depending on the shape that you're trying to emulate. So right now this needs to set up a little bit more. I put 7 total coils on, and we can tell this is really wobbly, and so I don't want it to collapse on me or crack or anything like that. And so what I need to do is let this bottom dry. We can use a hair dryer, and that'll help speed up the drying on this. There's some in the ceramic studio, or I can just let this sit for a little while. So what I'm going to do is, before I let it just sit, and this would also be good for if, as we're cleaning up for the end of the day, and you've got more height to build, but you're leaving for the end of class, and need to make sure that you're covering this for next time. One other extra step we're going to take, besides just covering these, I'm going to take a little moisture on my sponge, because I really want this top edge to stay hydrated, so that when I add coils on, it's going to be easier next time. And again, I'm not hydrating all of the clay. I'm not squeezing water out. I'm just running the wet sponge over this top edge. And then I can take a little bit of plastic and just cover this top edge. Like so. And that's going to allow the bottom of this to dry without that top getting too dry. And it was really important that we take care of those connection points. So at this point I can just let this sit. We'll come back later and start adding some more clay.